I guess I'm live, totally improvised, and on a Sunday afternoon, I thought, look at that, you could even see my phone. I thought I'd share some new lettering technique that I'm working on for a little project. Sorry for my distraction. I've got a little research I need to do too, so that'll take over the audio while I do this. Um, I'm gonna set up a little bit of chat, see if anyone actually even notices. But this is more for my own amusement and edification than it is for my vast audience of 100 or so. So, anyway, let's see how this goes.
The Black Death in Scandinavia.
In 1346, on the steppes of Asia, the pandemic that we now call the Black Death reared its ugly head. By 1347, it had moved west and south, striking the Crimea and, most importantly, the great city of Constantinople, which was a center of trade and culture and a political and religious capital. By late 1347 and into 1348, the plague continued its progress in a mostly clockwise direction, striking port cities like Messina, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, Marseille, and the island of Majorca. From these cities, what the great plague scholar Ole Benedictov has called bridgeheads, the great mortality began to move overland in a generally northwest direction. But at the same time, it was continuing to move much more rapidly over various waterways, hitting Britain in 1348 and ravaging it right through 1349 and into 1350, and then moving north into Scandinavia, striking Sweden in 1349 as well. What's important about understanding how the plague moves through the medieval European world is that it is exactly the trade routes, especially the sea routes, which were part of newly burgeoning and flourishing economy, the likes of which hadn't been seen since the days of the Roman Empire, that would help the plague move so quickly and effect such great devastation. If you look at a map that's color-coded according to the date the plague arrived in various locations, you can see just how true this is. Basic logic suggests that if the Black Death arrived in England in 1348, pretty soon all of Britain would be overcome, including Ireland, which was infected through its various port cities and trade networks. The fact that the Irish city of Dublin and the English city of Bristol were both affected around the same time suggests, though, that Ireland and England were both infected via trade from the continent, and not that Ireland was infected via England, which might seem like a logical conclusion given their proximity. Even more interesting is that Scotland, which is physically connected to England, doesn't suffer from the Black Death until 1350. By contrast, Norway, which lies on the other side of a vast expanse of water, gets hit with the plague earlier, in 1349. It's from Norway that Sweden's infection comes. Denmark was infected in 1350, but most likely by a separate wave of plague that was creeping up from the south. That wave would crash into another current of plague that entered Denmark via trade networks with Norway. More than one scholar has likened the movement of the plague to the tightening of a noose that moved clockwise around Europe until it finally ended up pretty much back where it began. In 1352, it struck much of Russia, including Novgorod and Moscow in 1353. While the distance between the steppes of Asia, where the plague began, and Moscow and its environs, where the first wave ended, is actually quite short, for the Black Death to get there, it had to take this really circuitous route, making a huge loop. There can be no clearer example of how established trade routes trumped simple proximity as the means of infection. In the next lecture, we'll examine the end of the first wave of the Black Death and the Russian experience of plague. But first, we're going to focus on Scandinavia and its experience of the Great Mortality. Now, as I just noted, Different parts of Scandinavia were infected at different times and by different routes. So, by one measure, it might not make sense to talk about the Scandinavian experience of plague. But by another, it makes total sense because the Scandinavian experience was marked by this really fascinating folktale response in which the Black Death was anthropomorphized variously into an old woman, a pair of children, an old man, and in some cases depicted as really frightening animals from hell, like a three-legged goat with blazing eyes. And these depictions seem to be found nowhere else. They are culturally unique to Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. The fifth Scandinavian country, Iceland, had a different experience with plague. Because Iceland, you see, completely escaped the first wave of the Black Death and didn't experience plague until 1402. This is very important information to have if time travel is ever invented and you find yourself transported back to the second half of the 14th century. If that should happen, and that in fact is the main plot of one of my favorite sci-fi / historical novels, Connie Willis's Doomsday Book, if that should happen, get yourself to Scotland, where you'll be good until about 1350. And then from there, book passage on the fastest ship to Iceland you can find. While I'm sort of joking here, I'm also kind of serious. I've often said that one of the best ways to learn about a particular period, to get the details and dates cemented firmly in your brain, is to read a really good historical novel and then expand and deepen that knowledge by reading histories. For example, the Brother Cadfael murder mysteries by Edith Pargeter, also known as Ellis Peters, were incredibly helpful when I was trying to understand Benedictine monasticism or the conflict between Stephen of England and his cousin Maud. And I got the basics of cathedral building and schematics from Ken Follett's The Pillars of the Earth. And by the way, if anyone is working on time travel to the Middle Ages, I'd like to offer myself as a test subject. But for the present, let's get back to Scandinavia. Now, first off, we have to deal with a controversy, and that is, could the Black Death actually have afflicted Scandinavia, or was it something else? The reason for doubt concerning the source of the epidemic that struck the north of Europe is that the main carrier of the infected fleas, the black rat, or Rattus rattus, if you want to use its scientific name, wasn't much to be found in Northern Europe. In fact, a different species of rat, Rattus norvegicus, is the most popular in the north, and its ancestor and that of Rattus rattus diverged from one another about 1.2 million years ago. Rattus norvegicus, or the Norway rat, as you may have guessed its name means, don't tend to host the fleas that carry Yersinia pestis. But at the same time, as many scholars have proven, the fleas that carry plague can live without a host for anywhere from 30 to 50 days and were easily transportable in merchant goods like cloth or grain, and thus the infection could have come into Scandinavia that way. Another thing that seems to be more and more clear is that pneumonic plague could be spread from person to person, and it doesn't necessarily seem to be the case that the bubonic form of the plague needed to also be circulating at the same time. For example, you'll recall the evidence from Avignon, which was struck fairly early on, and suggests that pneumonic plague might have actually arrived first and was followed later by an outbreak of the bubonic form. In any event, the question is pretty much settled that various forms of bubonic plague are what caused most of the high death rate in Scandinavia between 1349 and 1351. The source of the infection has been identified by many sources as a specific ship carrying wool to Norway that departed London in May 1349, probably intending to arrive and unload its cargo in Oslo. Somewhere en route, plague swept through the ship. One of the crew must have been infected, but didn't know it before embarking. Numerous accounts say that the whole crew died and the ship sailed on and drifted until it ran aground somewhere near Bergen. Other accounts say the ship didn't run aground at all, but was spotted drifting by people on shore somewhere on the west coast of Norway. Curious, they rowed out to see what had happened and then brought the disease back with them. Still other accounts suggest that some of the crew had died, but the remainder made it to Norway, where, while they were still alive, they infected the local residents. The image of the rudderless ghost ship, with all hands lost to plague, is certainly one of the most compelling images to come out of the story of the infection of Scandinavia, but some doubt that a drifting ship could have made it all the way to Bergen without running aground earlier. If you look at a map, you can see that navigation of the fjords on the way to Bergen would have probably required someone to be paying attention. Still, it's not impossible that the infection happened this way. According to one of the chronicles, Lawman's Annal, quote, "At that time, a ship left England with many people on board. It put into the Bay of Bergen, and a little was unloaded. Then all the people on the ship died. As soon as the goods from this ship were brought into the townsmen began to die. Thereafter, the pestilence swept all over Norway and wrought such havoc that not 1/3 of the people survived. The English ship sank with its cargo and the dead men and was not unloaded. More ships, cargo vessels, and many other ships sank or drifted widely around. And the same pestilence visited the Shetland Islands, the Orkney Islands, the Hebrides, and the Faroe Islands," end quote. No matter the details, what is certain is that the plague came to Norway from England via ship in late spring 1349. And from this account, it seems clear that plague was striking the islands off of what we think of today as Scotland before becoming a presence in the interior of that realm. Again, it's the route via the sea that's so important in understanding the spread of the Black Death. And this is how it almost came to Iceland. In August 1349, a ship was ready to sail from Bergen, Norway, to Iceland. Iceland's major trading partner was Norway. Indeed, Iceland had been settled primarily by exiles from Norway in the second half of the 9th century and was very dependent upon Norse exports for much of its goods. The ship preparing to embark was an Icelandic one on its way home. But just before the time of departure, one of the crew on board became ill. Recognizing that this was plague, the Icelanders canceled their journey and chose to remain in Norway, a decision that most certainly doomed them, but that spared their homeland the ravages of plague for another half century. When it comes to the spread of plague through Scandinavia, once again, it's the trade routes that are the culprits. Now, in general, the Scandinavian socio-political system was somewhat different from the rest of Western Europe in that feudalism was not as strongly or deeply pervasive. While still a primarily agricultural society, the land was mostly freely held rather than in fee or vassalage from the king or a lord. And there were many who lived in mountain settlements where agriculture could not offer a subsistence existence. Those who lived in the mountains were dependent on extensive trade networks running down to the coast for many of the goods they required for survival. And it's along these routes that the plague made its way inland through Norway and thence to Sweden and finally to Denmark, which was also suffering from plague coming up from the south. Interestingly, plague struck Denmark, Norway's neighbor to the south, before it struck much of the German-speaking lands, including Austria in the European interior. Another thing that's important to know about the socioeconomic structure of Scandinavia as it relates to plague is that the agricultural system here was particularly dependent upon young, unwed men, known as ungkarl, plural ungkarlar, as labor. This was different from a place like, say, England, where agriculture was performed by a family unit, with the oldest male, the father or head of the household, being arguably the most important component of the feudal manorial structure.
All right. I think that's about it. 15 minutes. Not too bad. Anyway, maybe someone will come across this in the future. In any case, it's back to that computer right there next. Anyway, until next time, see ya.